Welcome to the podcast this week with UAC. I'm Joseph Johnson, hosting again, and I'm joined again with friend and author Robert Heiduk, who wrote the KAATSU book. Thanks for joining me again, Robert. I appreciate it. You taking the time out again.
Thank you for having me on, Joseph.
So, number one, we want to make sure you can see the book. It's the KAATSU book here. It's on our site at uaconcepts.com. As you know, a lot of people know, we've carried stuff from all over, but this is a very unique concept and book, one that has had me really fascinated lately, with its so many applications that can be made. It's really amazing, to tell the truth. So today we wanted to we're taking a section by section, Robert, and you're kind of guiding us through this process of, well, what all are the benefits of KAATSU? What things can we do? So today we're going to talk about motor control, and then we're also going to talk about pain relief. So this is going to carry over a little bit over into the rehab side of things, but also right in the midst of training, like in the sport. So could you talk a little bit about, like, how does KAATSU affect motor control? What's going on there?
Okay, so I think to explain it a little, we should give some sport-specific examples to show a vivid way how it works in a sport-specific environment. And we talked about, we would like to give our viewers two areas of sport-specific example. One is a game sport, and one is an individual sport example. And I think basketball is a good example because it's very common in the US and also in Europe. Depending on the way the game developed in the last couple of years, we saw different athletes coming up in the last couple of decades, depending on altering the rules of the game and the tactics. And imagine the following. Let's say you train shooting on the basket. You train it, but usually you train it when you completely fresh. So this is a good methodology to learn for newcomers, because one thumb rule is, if you would like to try to get better in a skill or learn a new skill, try not to do it in the state of fatigue. But if you already mastered this skill, this is a complete different thing, because if you have different game situation, you have also to be precise or you have to maintain your shooting precision when you are under physiological and psychological pressure. So it means you have to maintain shooting accuracy while you have high levels of lactate in the body. And this is a complete different game. So the coach has to develop a methodology how he can create this physiological stress with those high lactate levels in training. So it is the goal to simulate competition stress and train the skills under the situation of competition stress. Because I can have the best shooter, if he's under stress with high lactate levels and he loses his shooting accuracy, we can lose the game.
So primarily what's going on here then is physiological, but it's kind of spilling over to the neurological, I guess, in some way, because in games, fatigue, the physiological starts to strongly affect the neurological, correct? Like the motor skills start to deteriorate under the state of fatigue. And so this is kind of prolonging that, or I guess enhancing the neurological skills while you're fatigued. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, absolutely, because it is a different physiological environment. Because everybody knows fatigue is a very complex thing. It's a part neurological, a part physiological or biochemical. But it's very complex. But nevertheless, for the practitioners, it means that you have to create the situations in the training session. But this has to be in the past very difficult, because you need very much recovery to simulate a competition, as we know. So the problem is we have no time or no recovery resources to create these amount of fatigues in the training session, because otherwise I would need a very long recovery period. If I take on the KAATSU bands on the arms, for example, or on the legs, I can create lactate level in a very short period of time with a very low mechanical load. So if I remove the bands, I can recover very, very fast and do it in the next session again. So as we know, the repetition is important, but I cannot repeat enough when I'm not recovered fully. So KAATSU solves this problem because I am able to get in those competition-like peripheral fatigue zones, and if I remove the bands, I recover very fast.
So this is kind of like a situation where, like, a lot of times coaches will say, you know, you want to be able to make shots under the state of fatigue and duplicate it. And basically what KAATSU allows you to do is to bypass the mechanical consequences of fatigue and still, you know, kind of take advantage of that concept without the consequences of mechanical fatigue. That's basically the crux of what
Yes.
KAATSU brings to that, correct?
Absolutely. And the coach can add additional stressors. If you have the bands on, you have those high lactate levels, and you shooting. This is a very isolated situation. A good strength and conditioning coach would add different or additional stressors. For example, you have to let's say you have to make stressor decision making. So isolated throwing, even under fatigue, is not sport specific, because you have to make decisions. Yeah. So what, for example, you can make a tactical game out of it, or you can add two balls. So two players. So you see that you have many possibilities to create complex situations, which you normally not would be able to create in a traditional training session. So this is I think a way for very high level athletes, because they have to master the challenge under the higher amount of fatigue.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's enormous. Like that's kind of almost groundbreaking, I think, for an athlete or for a coach to be able to use that to his advantage. It's almost yeah, I'm like breaking new ground. I guess it really is, because that's an idea that allows you to bypass a lot of consequence for a lot of benefit. So that's a huge it's a huge thing. How would this, so in the United States, and I'm sure in Germany too, a lot of people, especially, you know, once they're past their normal athletic career, a lot of people do distance running, you know, to stay in shape or, you know, still stay competitive. And then we have a lot of distance runners, you know, at the high school, college level, Olympic level. How would this, with something that's real repetitive, how would the application of KAATSU, how would that work?
Okay. So in this case, you would put on the leg bands, or the bands for the leg, and simply run with this bands on. And if you normally watch those recreational athletes, you are see the thousands on the marathon. I suggest you do two observations: how they run in the first part of the competition, huh? And how they enter the or how they run in the last kilometers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you start running, you are fresh, but if fatigue sets in, it comes to a breakdown of the cyclic movement patterns. They look bad, they look not fresh. And this is, by the way, the difference between top level runners. Look at the runners from Kenya. They look on the last kilometer. The quality of movement is as well as on the first kilometer. And this is the difference between a mediocre athlete or recreational athlete and those top level athletes. And the difference is because they have much more volume in their body, and so they are already very adapted. So a normal person cannot tolerate or has not the time to run as much, or he or she will be injured. And that's a situation where KAATSU can set in, because if you run with the leg bands, you create a metabolic environment, a peripheral environment, where you simply run, and then it's a strange feeling. Then you come to a feeling that it's muscle failure. So you cannot move your muscles. It's really crazy. I watched it also in at rowers. They row, and then they experience something they would never experience in a real race: muscle failure. So what you can enhance is local endurance and the maintenance of the movement patterns during an extreme fatigue. It's a little bit similar to the basketball example, but it's the same problem in the training session. In a usual training session, you will rarely reach the levels of fatigue you will reach in a long distance, very long distance run. So it's a different environment you create peripherally, and so you can improve your movement pattern while using the bands on the legs.
So once again, I'm going to put it into terms that I understand. Is that from what I understand, what you're saying is that you're going to be able to maintain high level. With using this in training over time, then your technique is not going to break down at the same place it would normally break down. Let's say if it broke down at like the 5 mile point. Now with KAATSU, maybe it doesn't start breaking down to much later in the race. Is that correct?
Yeah, or more precisely is you can then more focus on your technique, because maybe from your brain or from your central system, you want the goal of the session is, okay, I will start to become very, very quickly fatigued, but I must train to maintain the movement quality. And therefore, I think it is a more a matter of the methodology to create a consciousness what will happen in order to improve this.
So this could be, and in both cases, I think with the basketball shooting, it's the application could be various, like it could be in the off season or during the season. With a distance runner, how would they integrate KAATSU into their training? Would there be particular times of year that would be most beneficial, or near to the season? How would that be applied?
Yeah, it would be very beneficial to use it in the competition preparation. Let's say 8 weeks. You can start 8 weeks prior your first competition. when your distance run are more intensive, or you use it more in an interval.
What separates an elite, world-class athlete from everyone else? Their genes make them quicker, react faster, and more explosive. What if there was a way to, in a sense, turn on those elite athlete genes in the average person? Recent advances in genomic research and sports nutrition have proven this is now possible. Introducing MyoSync by Nootromic Sport Nutrition. Multiple studies show it increases quickness, explosiveness, and strength. In most cases, your vertical increases by at least 1 inch an hour after it's taken. Through a proprietary blend of ingredients, MyoSync in effect flips the switch on those genes that make you jump higher, run faster, and lift heavier weights. Here are several MyoSync testimonials.
This is Daniel Stokes. He's a sprinter. What was your best time before we started training this season with MyoSync?
21.5.
And what's your best time as of today?
20.7.
Could you explain to us what the fast twitch muscle supplements done for you, MyoSync?
It made me more explosive. It helped with my reaction time off the ground, bring my knees up quicker, and I continually progress.
This is Matt Tomey, head strength and conditioning coach for football and men's basketball at Michigan Tech. If you haven't tried Nootromic Sport Nutrition's supplement MyoSync yet, you're definitely missing out. I've had athletes here try the supplement and really enjoy the benefits, including an immediate improvement in vertical jump of about 1 inch. MyoSync really stands out with its ability to improve power output, speed, reaction time, even potentially quick decision making. If you haven't checked out this unique supplement yet, go ahead and pick up a bottle of MyoSync and give it a shot and just see for yourself.
Here is lead formulator Rick Bruner's brief explanation of MyoSync.
MyoSync evolved out of the neuroproteomic research we conducted starting back in 2005 to nutritionally boost the speed strength traits of well-trained athletes. These speed strength traits could include things like reaction time, starting power, maximal speed, quickness and agility, and also fine motor skills. Double-blind placebo studies as well as many outcome studies have been conducted on well-trained athletes from many sports and of many ages. The results of this research have shown a sizable boost in muscle contractions as well as the synchronization of these muscle contractions during speed strength activities.
Workouts. So that's very popular, very common, and very effective. So you would start with intervals without KAATSU, then you would put on the leg bands, do some intervals with the KAATSU till you come to the muscle failure or this burning, and then you would release the bands or put them away and do another intervals, and you get the boost, something like a physiological, maybe it's psychological or physiological, we don't know yet, but then you are able to recover and run very, very fast. I don't know if it's endorphins or if you maybe learn to use lactate more efficiently. I think we already talked about it, that lactate is today very important as a alternate fuel, and the body is able to use lactate or can learn to use lactate for the aerobic energy systems. If you train enough, the body learns to utilize lactate for the aerobic energy system, and that is a physiological advantage for the long distance runner, not only to maintain motor control or motor quality of his running, of this running technique, it's also a physiological effect.
So to conclude on that, what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that you could cut down, like for distance runners, they would be able to cut down the amount of miles they normally would run with the use of KAATSU and get the
Right.
same or better benefit.
Right. Let me give you one example or two examples I get as a feedback from those runners. They say, hey, I feel like in the end of a race. Or a soccer player told me, hey, I feel like in the last 5 minutes of a game. So you can create in a very short period of time, like a shortcut, I would say, yeah, the situation or metabolic situation or fatigue situation, like in the end of a certain competition of your desired sport.
That's awesome. I mean, and that would be something that, especially in distance sports, it would also be an injury prevention mechanism too, because we know that, like with distance runners, the main injuries come from over volumization of the amount of miles they run.
Absolutely. And think about the injury prevention in game sports. When do injuries happen in a game? At the beginning or at the end? I think it's clear that more injuries happens in the end part of games, because their players are more fatigued, and this would be a great tool also for injury prevention, because you can teach the athlete to maintain motor control of the whole body. And then he or she is able to have maintain a better motor control, and that's an awesome way for injury prevention.
As you were talking, I'm thinking that could be enormous. Like in the United States, baseball pitchers are very prone to injury, and they're highly paid, so it's very difficult to find a balance on how many pitches they should throw. And you find out that later in the game, their motor control starts to fade, so the pitches aren't as accurate, as sharp as they were at the beginning of the game. And then they're also much more prone to injury. So something like KAATSU would help them to preserve accuracy late in the game, and also as a preventive tool against injury.
Absolutely. And let me add one another thing, because maybe you also know that in the physiotherapy world there are movement quality tests, yeah, or pre-injury risk tests. But what is the value of those injury risk tests? Because they are done without load, and in a state where players or athletes are in a non-fatigue. So an injury prediction based on those tests is not, I don't think it's valid. You would need to make those tests in a state of where they are highly fatigued. Then probably they would have a value for injury prediction. But as a coach, I can only say the best way for injury protection is a good planning of volume and quality of training, and not faulty movement patterns.
Yeah. So in combination with a logical or rational plan, this could help to prevent most injuries, with maybe almost all injuries in throwing, if it's done correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So on that note, let's say the athlete's already injured, or maybe it's post-career, or in the physical therapy world with just the average patient. Pain right now is pain control is a huge subject in more than one way. It's one, because of return to play, being able to get back out and participate in the sport. This is very important. It's also important in terms of being able to find mechanisms to control pain that are non pharmacological. The use of different pharmacologicals and NSAIDs are prolific in the United States, especially as pain control. And then the options that are at the physical therapist disposal aren't always effective at controlling pain, or lack of range of motion, or whatever the case may be. Talk to me about how that works. Like with KAATSU, what you told me earlier was that there's a great application there with pain control, and also with the improvement of range of motion. explain that to me if you would.
Yeah. Like we all know, many patients with pain, for example, in joint pain, or let's take the shoulder, we see a decrease in range of motion. Yeah. And from our experience, if we put on the bands, for example, on the arm or both arms, and we do let them movements within their painless range of motion, and then we go very slightly on the movement of the border of their movement ability or of the range of motion, we can see a very, very significant increase in the range of motion and with less pain. This is what we can observe in daily practice. And sometimes the range of motion doubles under the new environment. And I think we have a good or solid physiological or neurophysiological basis to explain this. And let me explain this in the following way. There are peripheral receptors all over the body, and they are very sensitive for different sensory inputs. And if you, for example, put on the KAATSU bands, then the chemical environment changes very quickly, as we know. Yeah? And usually there are receptors which are able to sense pain. But if they get a new input, which is much stronger and more meaningful, they can switch and overlap this pain by the new chemical environment. So the patient doesn't feel the pain anymore because the sensory input is different. Now they get the new input from the blood flow and from the buildup of lactate, and so they feel the pain, don't feel the pain anymore. And what happens is that the range of motion increases instantaneously. So it is very solid neurophysiological explanation, and this is how maybe it works. Maybe it is also a change of the tissue, because if the tissue is there is a better blood flow, it is of course another precondition for a better range of motion.
So, with the changes that take place in terms of the pain relief, is that a permanent improvement? Is it temporary, or does it need to be, the KAATSU need to be repeated to control that? How does that work?
Yes, it is some of a part of the effect is permanently. But because you would need more sessions to improve the range of motion, because the brain has to learn, hey, everything's it's good, and with an increasing amount of sessions, the brain learns into the other direction, into the good directions, and forgets, I would say, the pain. We can override the pain. And for example, we know that we are able, if we increase proprioceptive input in any way, for example, if I rub with a brush or whatever, then I can also overlap this pain and increase range of motion. Sometimes I get immediate better strength results. And remember, those guys watching us and do weightlifting or powerlifting, sometimes they brush before a competition the body parts, and this is because the proprioceptive sensory feedback is then better, and then they can lift more immediately. It's a way of a different excitation, which is able to override the pain feeling.
So, and this brings like another kind of question, and this will spill into other stuff later as we go along, but I want to just briefly touch on the body's adaptation to KAATSU, because I know that this is can be the rate limiting factor with a lot of mechanisms, right? You know, a lot of mechanisms, if the body starts to adapt to it, like it would adapt to like NSAIDs, or it might adapt to, you know, other interventions, and they no longer work. This is what's the trap of especially narcotic pharmaceuticals, is that the body adapts. With KAATSU, is there does the body have an ability to adapt to it fully, or is it able to is KAATSU kind of always able to provide that stimulus?
From our knowledge of the practice, yes, because there are short or immediate effects, like in any other methods, and there are effects come over time and stay over time. But this field is from the science perspective very new, and I don't know. There is no research that explains those effects. So we have to be very careful with our explanation, and we can only tell the people what we observe, and the mechanics or mechanisms behind this remain still unknown.
So I'm presuming that people who have used KAATSU over time, and KAATSU is not a new idea, it's been around for a long time, that they've been able to at least induce some new levels of adaptation as they go along, not just as a lower level maintenance kind of intervention. So anecdotally, we would have to presume that it definitely is still able to provide some form of adaptation or stimulus. Would that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I learned from the Eastern approach. The Eastern approach to explain certain things is different to the Western approach.
Sure.
So the Western approach is always that science will go in those tiny molecular or different fields, but they don't see the whole thing. For example, let's say as a practitioner, I have also some experience with cancer patients, and what you see in a cancer patient, that is that the body is very weak. It becomes weaker and weaker and weaker depending on how your therapy, the way the therapy is. So the problem is that we have here in a downward spiral. So on the one hand, you have a weakened person that is not able to receive a stimulus that builds up the body. So many traditional methodologies simply do not work because the human organism is not able to tolerate the stimulus. And KAATSU, on the other hand, is able to give the person a stimulus which the body can adapt and get stronger. And this is a psycho-emotional effect, because if you have cancer, it has also an effect on your emotion. Imagine those people who are very sad and have not a positive attitude. The chance that they can have a victory over the cancer is lower than some person who's optimistic. So you have always to see the whole person and the psycho-emotional status of the person, and simply give them a way that the body can adapt and get stronger out of this difficult situation. And what I have to give the researchers, they can do it the research on a molecular basis. But this is not the way I work with the patients. And for me, the Eastern approach is the better explanation, because this is what I can observe. The other things, it remains something which is abstract for me. So it's good for researchers. They can say how the cancer, which is what is doing, or the metabolics of the cancer and whatever. But I can, as a practitioner, I see this stuff works, and you, as a researcher, can maybe give some explanations. But as you know, he will always put on this glass. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. Then I'm a cancer specialist, and I'm a psychologist. You know what I mean? The job of the coach remains that you are being a generalist. This is the main thing. So you have to be good at psychology, at writing training plans, and many other things. And this is maybe an old-fashioned job because we have so many specialists, but this would be maybe a topic of another discussion.
Yeah, and it will be, and you were just echoing things that I have said or thought many times over. There's a lot of people in science who I respect. They will reject different things out of hand because they can't explain it scientifically. But there's a mountain of anecdotal evidence that says there's something there that works. And so if, for example, you mentioned cancer. And you've seen different people treat cancer in a non-traditional way that has no scientific basis. And yet after they treated it non-traditional without the use of, maybe a lot of stuff that had been scientifically validated, but they were cancer-free when they were done. That's all that matters to me, is that it worked. So if the athlete, let's say, for example, improved, he got faster or stronger, whatever his objective was, then the method worked. If the patient, like if they were experiencing pain and now they aren't, it worked. We may not be able to explain what's going on the molecular level, but it doesn't matter as long as it works. So I think there's a balance, as I know that you do too, between the practitioner and the science, research end, is that typically a lot of times the practitioner is the one who kind of inspires the science because they find something that they can't explain that's working, and then the science goes back to try to explain what actually happened.
Yeah, and remember, the practitioner is always interested in science when science or research finding give them new practical conclusion. But this is in many cases not anymore the case, because in sport and in many fields, practice is always ahead of science, because science can only research what practitioners already do in our field. So this is without any doubt. And remember the many times science failed in their explanations. They say, hey, a couple of years ago we thought lactate was useless. Now we know lactate is very useful, for example. And what does this mean for the practitioners and for this methodology? Often nothing, because then they see, okay, we do it right, and our intuition was right, and the results we made with these methodologies were good or excellent. And so the value of science to make a science-based training should be viewed very critical in nowadays.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma here in the United States, anyway, because we don't have really a much of a scientific field in terms of sports performance. So because of that, there's and the coaches don't have anything to draw on, at least from the United States perspective, United States research. And this is our problem here. We don't have either one. So people use things that they think anecdotally may work, but it's never been validated, and the science isn't really researching anything of value. So it puts us in a weird position. In Europe, I know you guys have the difference in that the coaching level is pretty high, which holds the scientific community up to kind of a higher level too, where they have to be able to validate their findings in the face of what is going on actually in the field by high-level coaches. So it's an interesting dynamic. It's different in Europe than it is here in the United States. But this is fascinating, the whole idea here with the KAATSU, because I think there's no question whether or not what's going on works, and still getting explanation of those things scientifically is interesting as it comes in. But nonetheless, the practical says that it works, and it works in a lot of different ways and at very little cost, opportunity cost to the patient or the athlete. So this is undoubtedly very worthwhile looking into in the right way. And I want to focus on this for just a moment. We've seen a lot of things online with occlusion training or blood flow restriction training. The parameters to KAATSU are extremely specific, and there's definitely a level of competency that the practitioner needs, not just watching a couple YouTube videos. So I want to emphasize that this is very important. And Robert, if you'd like to end us on that, just kind of talking about the specificity of KAATSU and how important it is to observe that.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned very important things. We are faced over and over again that we see that now from first hand, people start to talk about a topic they have never done. So they research the internet, and then they try to tell you what to do, but they have no own experience. They talk about KAATSU without ever done any KAATSU. And that is the problem. How can someone give you practical advices that have never done KAATSU? So therefore, he or she has no idea about the differences between KAATSU, occlusion, or blood flow, call it whatever. And this is a huge gap. And I think what for me is very important, that we have an additional conversation about the big gap. It's a huge gap between science and practice, especially in the field of blood flow restriction and KAATSU training. But there are so many misunderstandings that we have to explain our viewers that they make not the same mistakes and misconceptions like the so-called experts or researchers. Because I can explain that a researcher is not necessarily an expert.
And that is why we're going to have to do some more editions of this, because there's so much here to learn. The more that I learn, the more questions I actually am having. So you can see that this is a huge area of information and a huge area of improvement that's possible for us the more we learn about it. So Robert, I appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us about this part. We're going to do it again in a week during this COVID crisis. We're going to keep this up and go through all of the different sections of the book. So I appreciate you taking the time again today like you have, and look forward to talking to you really soon.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.